I'm very happy to be with you all today. And of course, I wish I was listening to Isabel as well. But I will hopefully be able to provide you with some background on the program and also its implementation and our steps moving forward. And then I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards. I am using my earbuds so that when my one cat begins her afternoon yowl, hopefully that will be kept down for you, I'm hoping. And also my network adapter yesterday decided to just shut off for a little while. So if I do disappear, I will be back within 3 minutes. It's not the actual internet. All right. So as I'm sure you all know, we've been doing research on sexual assault for over 30 years in North America, and particularly on campuses. And the statistics basically show no decrease in rates at all. And so this brings us to a number of difficult questions. And so I wanted to start with just a few thoughts about sort of what has gone wrong before I start to talk about sort of a comprehensive plan going forward. And of course, my advance there. So one of the problems I think that we've faced is that sometimes we are raising knowledge, which is a very good thing. We're improving knowledge, but we equate it with prevention. And of course, knowledge is not prevention. We also do a fair amount, both in our activist work off campus and in our education work on campus, that is about increasing awareness. But again, we know that that is not prevention. So we have this very difficult problem that is a very complex one. And sometimes we have the wrong theories, right? We have the wrong theories of how to intervene because we have the wrong theories of what's going on. And when we have the wrong theories, then we actually are continuing along the way where we are not able to solve the problem. So I wanted to start by talking about what we do know about sexual violence, and that has been uniform across the years, although we are getting better data all the time, and that is that sexual violence is a gendered phenomena in many ways. And so we know that the vast majority of all victims and survivors of sexual violence are cisgender women, regardless of their sexual identity. And we know within this group, we're now starting to get some good data that says that bisexual women are at particularly high risk. We know among men that gay and bisexual men are at higher risk of experiencing sexual violence than heterosexual men. And we know that trans men and women are at higher risk of experiencing sexual violence than cisgender men. And in an occasional study, also then cisgender women, but not all studies. So we care about sexual violence committed against everyone, but we need to move forward making very targeted kinds of solutions. And the other thing that we do know for sure is that the vast majority of all sexual violence perpetrators are cisgender heterosexual men, with 98%, and this has been replicated again more recently, 98% of perpetrators of sexual violence against cisgender women being men. So as I alluded to, what we know from all of our research in health promotion and other forms of prevention, as well as sexual violence prevention, is that actually we need, for prevention to be effective, it needs to be targeted. So there is no one magic bullet, as we say, or no one size fits all. And when we try and do those universal things, usually our programs or interventions risk being effective for absolutely no one. So what we need is a comprehensive plan for sexual violence prevention. We obviously, the pressing thing is that we need to end perpetration. And if we were able to do this, then we could all wrap up all of our plans and we would be set. But unfortunately, we aren't even close to this goal yet, with almost all programs designed to actually reduce perpetration entirely ineffective. Or if we are starting to get some inklings of effective programming, particularly for men, a combination of social norms education with bystander together in men-only programs. We're starting to see some small reductions, but they're not maintained for the longer term. So there's still a lot to be done here. And in the meantime, so we are also working to change the culture. And so we're doing all of these things at once, but culture change, as you know, takes time. And so again, we can't wait. We are also working on another front, and many of you might be working on these kinds of initiatives where we need to empower all of our citizens, and sometimes we're talking about our campus citizens, sometimes more broadly, to become empowered bystanders. That is, to take responsibility and intervene when they see that something is going wrong, or when they see something, someone acting in a way that is sexually coercive or violent. But often when we talk about this, we say that bystander programs are effective. They are effective in changing bystander attitudes and bystander intentions and bystander behavior. They are not effective, particularly on campus, at reducing victimization or perpetration. And part of the reason for this is that bystanders are actually only present in a very small proportion of all sexual violence situations. So we also can't rely only on this. So this means we need another goal as well. We need to work on all of these at once, and that is to provide girls and women with the information and skills they need to defend themselves. So I will unpack this more, obviously. So the program I developed, and I will refer to it as EAAA or Flip the Script with EAAA, but the full name that you'll see in the research studies is the Enhanced Assess, Acknowledge, Act Sexual Assault Resistance Program. It has this long and very wordy name because I was trying to give credit to the work of Patricia Rose and Mary Koss, who had synthesized all of the theory and research in 2001 and suggested that this kind of a program might work, but they hadn't put it into action. And so that's what I did. And then the enhanced word is referring to the sexuality component that I added to their theoretical frame. So now we use the term flip the script with EAAA, which is much friendlier for English students. And that's thanks to Sarah Dethridge, who came up with that idea. And I will present for you later on the French name, but also we don't yet have that catchy phrase. So we'll be looking for your help, I'm sure. So the program focuses on the largest group of students on our campus who are at high risk of sexual assault, and that is self-identified women of all sexual identities, all abilities, and all backgrounds. There are a few other researchers, and I'm part of some of these teams working to develop effective prevention to reduce victimization for other groups of students, and I'll talk about some of those at the end, but they aren't available yet. So this program was the culmination of a lot of years of work, and it's continuing still, but before the first findings, there was 10 years of work. I built the program basically on the amazing feminist social psychological theories that had become available to explain the barriers for women in facing sexual assault from men that they know, and on the empirical evidence, and also on the long history and traditions of feminist activism and practice in the community, and basically pulled all those things together. So I want to start by talking about what the logic is of resistance education. And so, this analogy was less loaded in the last few years than it is this year. But the way that I first convinced CIHR reviewers about, I tried to explain what the program was doing, was to use a medical analogy or a health analogy, with the idea being that when we are in a room, we have no control over what bacteria or viruses are in that room, right? It's not, we have not made them there, but we are able to do things for ourselves, things like sleeping well, eating well, exercising, that boost our immune system so that when we are in the presence of those things, we are better able to resist. And so that kind of logic is one way of thinking of it, if that's helpful to you. Another is the other symbol on the page, which is basically the empowerment, that this is about empowerment. So the program directly undermines woman blaming through both the content and the training of the facilitators. So it sends a very clear message to the young women who are taking the program that when we're talking about risk, this risk does not belong to the young woman, or this does not belong to us. It's only present, elevated risk is only present when there's a man willing to engage in coercive behavior actually present. The other things that the program makes clear is that women are always the only ones themselves. They are the best judge of what they can and should do in any situation, totally up to them. And that survival of sexual violence from sexual violence is successful resistance. So the program does not, it's not prescriptive, it does not tell women what they should do, and it doesn't hold women responsible for men's behavior. So what is what does it look like when it's being offered? It's a small group intervention that is facilitated by two young women who are similar in age, just that bit older. So no authority figures is very important to how this works. So we have the under 30 sort of rough rule, and they are facilitating together in these small groups. The program is designed to be relevant to the youngest women in university, in this case, for this version of the program. First year when the risk is highest, and also sort of under 25 outside of those constraints. It's 12 hours total, so 4 3-hour sessions, and you'll see the names of the sessions there. Originally, I had thought that the program would be more effective if we did, one program a week, weeknights, and there was more time to consolidate knowledge. But very quickly in early pilot tests, young women, about 50% of young women preferred to have the workshop all in one single weekend. So basically two units back to back and on 2 days. But it's also sometimes offered in like 2 Saturdays in a row. So I'm going to give you an example of a situation for you to hold in your mind while I'm talking about the actual content of the program. So a young woman goes to the door of her apartment when there's a knock there, and it's her roommate's boyfriend. And she tells him that her roommate is not home, but he insists on coming in anyway. Now that seems really off to her, but he insists on coming in, and when he comes in, he proceeds to act in ways that are making her increasingly uncomfortable. She starts to worry about what her roommate is going to think of him and how upset she's going to be, and what she might think about her, and she starts to reason with him. Now, all of those reactions are completely normal reactions to a situation that should be entirely safe, that is this context of your own home, and also with someone who you should be able to trust, someone you know and perhaps even like. But those totally normal reactions also delay our acknowledgement of how dangerous the situation is and our action. So now I'm going to tell you a bit more about what the program does then and what the content is. So the program is completely framed in a positive sexuality context. It ends with a 3-hour emancipatory sex education component. And the idea of it is to actually decrease the time that it takes for young women to assess any situation as dangerous and to begin to take action. Really reducing those emotional obstacles to seeing a man you know and maybe like or love as someone who could be dangerous to you, and maximizing the chances that they will use what we know from research are the most effective tactics to reduce the chances of violence or to interrupt the violence. So I'm going to take you through each of the 3 4-hour sessions, but knowing, of course, this is like the briefest of abstracts because I can only touch on it, and I'd be happy to answer any more questions. So one of the things we know from research is that there's no point in talking on and on or engaging in activities if you don't actually see them as relevant to you. And we all have an optimism bias. And by that, I mean that we know that bad things happen, and we are very likely to assess that they are likely to happen to other people, but we are much less likely to think that we ourselves are at risk. And this is true for anything, for car accidents, cancer, and including sexual violence. So in this case, the program really it works to undermine this idea that acquaintance sexual violence cannot happen to every person in that room. So that undermining this idea that it can't happen to me or my friends. And again, doing this in a way that doesn't increase fear, but rather just makes this a realistic appraisal. The other main point of this assess unit, the first unit, is to actually redirect from all of the cultural messages about what's dangerous that focus on strangers and provide information on what we actually know from research are the empirically supported risk cues or danger cues in men's behavior and in social contexts. Now, these risk cues are not common sense in many cases, especially the context ones. So I'm going to talk about one and show you some of the others. So we know from research that isolation is a risk cue or danger cue. In other words, when there is isolation, perpetrators have advantages. They have more advantages, and so the risk of sexual violence is high. But the kind of context that comes into most girls and young women's minds or women's minds is this kind of feared situation of the underground parking lot. When in fact, the kind of isolation that is most likely to be a risk in acquaintance situations is this kind of situation, where there is moving away from an area where there are a lot of other people to one where there is fewer. And also in this case, where there is sound separation. So there's isolation from the rest of the people because the music is very loud and no one could hear you. So redirecting to these kinds of things. And of course, we know that alcohol increases risk no matter who is drinking it, and or whether neither of the people are drinking it themselves, but there is alcohol in the situation. And indoor locations, the home is the most common site of all sexual assaults, and also nighttime, mainly because all of these things coalesce. So this kind of party situation, but of course it could also be the very small group of people hanging out in someone's home. In terms of danger cues in men's behavior, many of these are the kinds of things that young women will tell you that they actually, like, they give them a yuck kind of factor. They detect these themselves as being like unpleasant. So for example, sexual entitlement, which is shown here, an example of that, where someone is sexualizing a situation that was not sexual, right? It sort of makes you feel like, ugh. And so part of what the program is doing is to reinforce young women's intuitions on these things, their sense that this is awful, and saying, in fact, the research does support those feelings. And so here are some of the others, but we have a particular focus on persistence, which whether it happens in non-sexual or sexual situations is a big red flag for sexual violence risk. So I'm moving away from assess now and into the second unit, acknowledge. And here, this unit addresses the fact that we know from research that women's traditional gender socialization and the goals that are related to that in terms of the focus on interpersonal relationships and maintaining those relationships can actually be serious obstacles to resistance. And so acknowledge is the most theoretically important of all of the units, and the one that's least like any of the other kinds of sexual violence education that exist. Excuse me for a second. So in this unit, this really is unpacking traditional female socialization as many young women need assistance with overcoming that kind of socialization and overcoming the associated emotional barriers, both to acknowledge risk cues when they're present from men that they know, and to just trust themselves. So you can see on the right-hand side of this scale, the idea that your sexual rights, your personal safety, and personal integrity are worth more. In a sense, we need to put more on that side of the scale, and that those other things, which may be important values in some ways, are not as important in a dangerous situation. So acknowledge explicitly talks about the limits or of these otherwise positive characteristics, really suggests that niceness at all costs and the desire not to hurt other people, which are wonderful in many situations, in a dangerous situation are an obstacle to our safety. And also tries to undermine, particularly for heterosexual women, that this sort of the motivation that having a male partner is more important, and so that it is something that we would override our other judgments in certain situations for that. And then it provides a context for exploring what your own personal values and emotional responses and barriers are. So we're not presuming that any particular young woman has any particular, but they are figuring out for themselves which ones are an issue for them, and then having practice to try and undermine them. The acknowledge unit also importantly debunks what I call the miscommunication hypothesis, which we know actually slows response in dangerous situations. So this is the idea that men just don't understand and women are just not clear enough about their refusals, when in fact the research shows that people of all genders are able to read very subtle as well as obvious cues of non-consent and disinterest. And we also know from research that the majority of women who are raped by men actually used the crystal clear verbal indications of their non-consent, like no and stop, you're raping me, and the men continued anyway. The other part that Acknowledge tries to deal with is that typical perpetrator responses in response to women's refusals are often very confusing and cause women to not trust themselves. And so Acknowledge exposes those realities and then and really reinforces women's own judgment and their own knowledge that they have. So the third unit, ACT, is the one many young women come in very excited about. And it is a 3-hour unit. 2 hours of it, the last 2 hours, are the actual verbal and physical self-defense. But in this case, so this is based on WENDO, Women's Self-Defense, which is the oldest feminist self-defense organization in Canada, still going strong. And but in this case focuses on the kinds of strategies that acquaintances are particularly likely to use, and so therefore gives women tools against those particular strategies. The first hour of this session is debunking self-defense myths, ideas like if you fight back, you'll be hurt worse, and also provides the information on what we know from the research about what are the most effective strategies for resistance. And just in case this wasn't familiar to you, I don't like to present this without telling you what that research says, but it's very clear that forceful verbal resistance in many of these kinds of ways is very effective against both stranger and acquaintance attacks, and especially earlier stages of an interaction. That forceful physical resistance is also extremely effective and is the one thing that really works after there is incapacity, so where a woman has fewer options available to her. and also leaving or running away if that's possible at the earliest possible stage. So we know that when these happen, there is less likely to be completion of sexual violence if penetration was attempted, and also the injuries are not any higher than they would have been without resistance. The thing is, women use these kinds of strategies all the time, but these are the particular strategies that women are least likely to use against men they know without this kind of education and training. They are most likely to use the least effective strategies against men they know. So this is why this is critically important. So thinking again about that situation that I described earlier, a young woman who's taken Flip the Script with EAAA would first of all recognize that this man's persistence on coming in, even though she made it clear she didn't want him to, is in fact one of those danger cues, and that her gut, that if something is wrong with this, that she absolutely should trust herself, and so she may, for example, decide to close that door no matter what he's continuing to say. If he came in anyway, as she starts to feel uncomfortable, she is very likely to still be more worrying about what her roommate might think of him and of her. But if she's had the program, then she also is much more likely to say, you know what, I can worry about those things later. My safety is important, and to take action as soon as she starts to feel uncomfortable. She would also be very likely to start with, she would have identified for herself a whole toolbox of effective strategies. She very likely would start with a forceful verbal strategy, and if it didn't work, she would know to escalate and to keep on going until she is safe. One thing she might also do is, at the point where he won't leave her apartment, someone who's had this kind of training is very likely to realize that the isolation of the apartment is increasing the risk to her and actually leave their own apartment. This is something that is not usually thought of by people who don't have this kind of training. So you might be wondering about this example where there is a non-romantic situation. Where does sexuality education fit in? Well, for those situations, particularly for heterosexual and bisexual women, where a romantic or sexual relationship is desired or ongoing with a man, what EAAA tries to do is it actually flips the script and puts women's desires at the center of any discussion. So this unit is primarily based on the Our Whole Lives Sexuality Education Program and borrows from a number of the parts of the curriculum. And so it increases women's comfort talking about sex, their knowledge about the range of sexual behaviors that are possible, particularly trying to move to a whole range of, not to just think that sort of penetrative sex is sex and that women don't have other options, including other orgasmic options, if that's what they prefer, to increase or reinforce their own personal values about romantic and sexual relationships and the things that they hold as characteristics that they think are admirable in those situations, and also thinking about sexual behaviors and whether or not they would desire them, not before such a situation as when someone has actually started to do it or is asking them to engage in it. And they're also practicing with skills in negotiating desired sex, like safer sex, and also initiating sexual activity with a consenting partner that they do want. So that is the program in a nutshell, there is evidence that it works. We have all kinds of data from a randomized control trial at 3 Canadian universities with over 900 young women, and you might wonder why I said over 900 and there's only 893 mentioned on the slide, and that's because some young women lied about their age in the screening interview in order to get into the study and get the program, but then they were truthful on the survey, so they weren't included. And we followed up for up to 2 years. And some of you may be aware of these findings. These are the ones published in 2015. 1 year later, the program reduces the completed rape experience by women by 46%, so just less than half. And yes, if you see the percentage at the top of the blue line, that does mean that women in the control group, 10% of them did experience a completed oral, anal, or vaginal rape by the end of the first year after they were enrolled in the study. So this translates into basically one group of young women need to get the workshop in order for there to be one fewer rapes experienced. The program also works even better on attempted rape, which suggests that women are actually detecting those cues earlier and getting out earlier. So we have 63% reductions in attempted rape at 1 year. And you see the calculation on the number that would need to receive it. If you put the attempted rape and completed rape together, that means 13 young women would need to have the program in order for there to be one fewer attempted and completed rapes. And the program also worked to decrease other forms of sexual violence as well. And the effects are maintained for 2 years without a booster, which was the biggest surprise to me. So how does the program accomplish this? So we now know, we've now conducted a mediation analysis on the other outcomes to sort of understand what is going on. And in fact, what we found is that the theories about what is going on were all supported in our mediation analysis. So first, we are able to decrease the belief that women are in some way responsible for rape through their own behaviors and general rape myth acceptance. Women's is generally already low, but we're able to reduce it even further and keep it down for 2 years. And we're also able to reduce that optimism bias that I talked about at the beginning, where we actually are increasing their perceptions of the personal risk of acquaintance rape just above the midpoint. Now, these are not important for sexual assault directly. They don't lead directly to reductions in sexual violence. But what they do is that they are responsible for explaining the reduction. The program reduces or increases the perception of risk, both faster and more detection of risk. And these two things, reduction of rape myths and decreased optimism bias, are important. That's how that happens. That detection of risk becomes better through reducing those other things. The program also increases, not surprisingly, given the content, the women's knowledge of what is most effective, and also their willingness to use the most effective tactics and at earlier stages of coercion, and increases their confidence that they could defend themselves if they needed to. And that little greater than 76% you see over there, this is showing you that actually this model predicts 76% of the variance in the reduction of attempted rape, and it actually predicts 95% of the reduction in completed rape. The other very important thing that I wanted to test, because some people were concerned, that some of my feminist friends were concerned that give women all of this information, won't they blame themselves more if they aren't able to get away, or if they aren't able to use them? And I was pretty sure, because of the way that it was taught, was that this wouldn't be the case, but we are able to show that, in fact, women who were experienced a completed rape after they took the program had lower self-blame than women who had not had the program. You might also be asking yourself, yes, but does it only work for white women? As many times there are those kinds of biases. For every subsample where we're able to do the comparisons, the program works across subgroups of women. So it works for both white women and racialized women. It seems to work particularly well for Black women, even better than for white women, for example. It works for heterosexual, lesbian, and bisexual women. In fact, there's some suggestions those are small ends, but it seems that lesbian and bisexual women, they have a higher risk of violence from men, of sexual violence from men, and it seems to work even better for them than for straight women. The other important thing is, does it work for survivors? Other programs for women that call themselves risk reduction programs, which I don't use that language, have not, they've only been effective for women who had never been previously victimized. And that is not the case for EAAA. The program worked as well for women who had experienced rape or attempted rape prior to taking the program. And just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that survivors have written to me to tell me, here is one, and neither of these are from my own campus where the program is being used. So what she said was, she said that she'd been through quite a few types of counseling and therapy after having been sexually assaulted, and that she was doing fairly well overall. But one thing that was highlighted in EAAA was that survival is success. And she said that this is something that will stick with her, and it meant a lot to hear it, and it altered her perspective on what she'd been through. Another survivor who had been raped in high school and had said her social world had restricted to the point where she was in university, she was barely going out except for her classes, thanked me for giving her the freedom back. So now I'm going to switch over and to talk about sort of what, that's the program, that's the evidence, but then how is it being used, or how can it be used? So right now, FlipScript with EAAA is the only program available for campuses that actually reduces the sexual violence that women students experience. But as you can probably already tell, it's effective because it is intensive, right? It is longer than most of our education on campus, and its format is small groups. So it means it's not cheap or simple. It's, you know, definitely much cheaper and simpler to stick something online. But of course, it also doesn't work. So what did I do to make this be able to be used more easily? I created a nonprofit so that this couldn't be commercialized. I did research on what the best models of transfer of training are, and use a train the trainer model so that campuses are creating their own infrastructure then to implement and maintain fidelity in a sustainable way. And provide manuals for both the campus trainers and the facilitators that they hire. And in fact, these are highly scripted manuals with activities and instructions and so on to make sure that the program can be adhered to. The number of universities and colleges is increasing all the time, with COVID having put a serious dent in all of our work, as I'm sure is the case on your campus. So pretty much a direct halt in all the countries in the world, but it is in all of these countries, or has been until before COVID. The other thing I'm happy about is I'd always hoped that sexual assault centers would be the leaders, because they already are, for campuses, and could be trained to offer the program on campuses. But there was quite a bit of resistance from universities in the beginning, at least in English universities. But now finally, this is starting in both Canada and the US, where community feminist organizations are being trained to implement the program. So what are our successes? There are many, but I'm just putting it in a nutshell. We have high satisfaction with the training that we provide at the SARE Center for campus staff who come to become campus trainers. We also, when the program is implemented on campuses, we get very positive evaluations from students across all of the countries, and also high levels of attendance. So in the trial, we got remarkably high attendance of 78% of young women attended 3 or 4 of the units. And some people wondered whether that was a research artifact. I didn't think so. It isn't. So that is a very positive thing. And one thing that we haven't researched, but we hear over and over from facilitators on all the campus, is that facilitating the program actually changes them as well, and they become more committed. The good thing about this is we always advise that you not invest all this training in facilitators who can only be there for 1 year. This doesn't seem to be a problem with facilitators staying year after year. Now, what are the obstacles? Well, first of all, the first three here are primarily obstacles to even getting a commitment to implement Flip the Script with EAAA on campus. You probably have all come up against these things. Universities think they're already doing enough. So they're saying, fill in the blank on your campus. We already have this one thing, and isn't that enough? And you saw from the early part of my talk, I know it isn't, as I'm sure you do. In some cases, there are pockets of concern within our feminist communities where because of the horrendous women-blaming kinds of programs or campaigns targeting women in the past, there is a belief that any program that is focused on women must be women-blaming. And of course, we have empirical evidence that's not the case, but that still is an issue on some campuses. A broader issue is about universities not being willing to commit financial resources and funds to pay student facilitators, for example, but also the problem that I'm sure many of you are experiencing, where the staff who are working on these issues on campus they're already overworked. And so there needs to be time carved out for this, and that is an obstacle on some campuses. And for some campuses where the program is being implemented, recruitment is not going as well as they had hoped. In other words, harder to attract young women to the program than they thought. On some campuses, this is not a problem. And it seems to be like there'd be some years where it's fine, and then years where it's not. The same kinds of recruitment strategies don't work as well. So this is something that is in progress. So what is in progress research-wise? Right now, I've just wrapped up with my colleagues an implementation effectiveness trial, which basically is to assess how this transfer of training has gone to 5 Canadian universities who were implementing the program. So how did our training from our lead trainers to their campus trainers and them to their facilitators, how did all of that go? How do the dynamics of particular campuses and historical circumstances affect all of those things? And then we're also studying the young women students who are signing up for the programs and doing evaluations of the program for a 6-month period. So we're actually going to see if sort of what are the levels of effectiveness when this is used in the real world, and what campus factors are facilitators and barriers. The RCT is also being replicated in the US, but this has been paused due to COVID. I always knew, right? All of us who do sexual violence work know that 50% of all rapes that women experience happen by the time we are 18. So knew that it needed to go younger than university. But I was not willing to do all of that research and development in a context with school board and parental consent and all of that. So I started with the youngest women in university as a pragmatic thing. And now we have adapted the program for younger girls, and we're on the verge. We're supposed to start evaluating it in last fall in a waitlist control RCT with girls in 4 regions of Ontario, but this is paused by COVID, as you can imagine. Now, this is the one that is probably of most relevance to all of you, is that we also, Isabel Daniel and many of you who are also present are part of a CIHR funded grant that adapted the program, translated the program into French, and is going to be studying this in Francophone university context in both Quebec and New Brunswick. This is the name of the program in French, BÉRA. And as I mentioned, I alluded to earlier, we are still working on an equivalent for Flip the Script, a catchy name that young women will be attracted by, and that has theoretical meaning. I know that because of COVID, we have been delayed. And so if you are from a university or college or cégep that has not been part of this already, there probably is room to still include you, and you should contact Isabel. And there's been a number of other evaluation studies in other contexts that are going on or are about to happen. The other adaptations that you might also be interested in, we have been adapting the program for online synchronous delivery, and this is not a COVID thing. Just it started before COVID and would not be appropriate for COVID. So I will explain that later if you have a question about that. But we are in early stages. We are just about to start the theater test with one group of young women to see how well the adapted program works before we do a small pilot. And then we'll be looking for more funding to fully evaluate it. That's with Sarah Peitzmeyer at the University of Michigan, who's leading that with me. And we've always had questions. Trans women have always been included in the program, but the program was developed based on a research base that was almost exclusively based on cisgender women's experience. So when we're looking at what can we make an adaptation, is it appropriate to make an adaptation for students under the trans umbrella, we first needed to go back and actually create a research base because there wasn't one. Only now starting to do just basic statistics on experiences of sexual assault. And so Sarah Peitzmeyer is leading this study also, and we are in the early stages. And there are other adaptations I can certainly talk about if you have questions. I wanted to show you two of the kinds of posters that we use just as to wrap up on campuses in English Canada and around the world. We use others as well. The one on the left is the one that pulls more for activist students, making it clear what resistance is, and sort of much in the line of resistance also to anti-Black racism, to homophobia, and so on, making that clear. The one on the right is meant to appeal to women whose interest is more in sexuality and to make visible the sexual education components of the program. And we have other posters that actually appeal to the largest group of students on campus who don't have any prior background or specific interest, and so that speak to them. So we've been doing some work on recruitment to try and come up with things to boost that. And that I'm wrapping up. Sorry, I know I was rapid talking at some points, and I hope it wasn't too rushed. I wanted to leave lots of time for questions. Thank you.